Before the sun first rose over Middle-earth, Morgoth had already gathered spirits of fire beneath his hand, and Ungoliant had already learned to hunger for light. The spirits that became the Balrogs had entered the world as Maya, but they descended into the thought of Melkor and were corrupted with him, taking forms in which fire burned beneath darkness. Terror went before them. Their weapons were swords and whips of flame, and above them stood Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs and High Captain of Angband, black-armoured in battle, bearing an axe and a many-thonged scourge. Ungoliant belonged to no order that the histories clearly name. Her beginning was lost even to the Eldar, who remembered the first darkness. She took the shape of a monstrous spider and surrounded herself with unlight, a void that did not merely conceal what lay within it, but seemed to devour the radiance around it. Morgoth found her in Abathar, beneath the southern mountains of Armen, and promised to feed her hunger if she would aid him. Together they came unseen beneath the trees of Valinor. Morgoth wounded the trees with his spear. Ungoliant set her black beak to their wounds and drank until their shining sap was gone, then drained the wells of Arda, swelling until even Morgoth feared the vastness beside him. They fled across the Helcaraxë into Middle-earth. There Ungoliant demanded every treasure Morgoth had taken. One by one she consumed the stolen jewels, yet when he refused her the Silmarils, she cast her webs around him and closed upon him. His cry shook the mountains. The Balrogs came from Angband through the dark, their whips cutting her webs with flame, and drove her south. She entered Nan Dongorteb, the valley of dreadful death, and there she bred with the great spiders that already haunted its ravines. What became of Ungoliant at last was never witnessed. One account held that her hunger turned upon herself. No grave, husk, or corpse was ever found. Her shadow endured instead, through her offspring. Yet not every great creature of the young world arose from corruption. Oromi rode through the untrodden forests upon Nahar, whose coat was white beneath the sun and silver beneath the moon, and whose hooves were shod with gold. The sound of those hooves awakened fear in the servants of Morgoth, and hope in those who heard them approaching through the wild. Above the mountains flew the great eagles, servants and messengers of Manwë, far larger and longer lived than common birds, endowed with speech and wisdom. Greatest among them was Thorondor, king of eagles, whose wings spanned 30 fathoms. In the forests, another guardianship was prepared. Yavanna feared that the children of Ilúvatar would fell the trees without pity, and in answer to her concern, spirits awoke among the Olvar.
These were the Ents, the shepherds of the trees, towering, slow-growing beings whose bodies resembled the trees they guarded, some smooth and pale like beeches, some dark and rough like oaks, some long-fingered like branches, others heavy-rooted and broad. Their voices descended into long, resonant speech, and their memories stretched across ages that later peoples would scarcely understand.
Beside them were the Entwives, who loved not the ungoverned forest, but orchards, gardens, grain, and ordered growth. The distinction would one day become a wound that neither endurance nor memory could heal. When the elves first awakened at Cuiviénen, things already moved beyond the reach of their fires. Some vanished, fearful shapes pursued those who wandered alone, and from the hatred of Morgoth came the race that the elves named Orcs. No final account fixes the manner of their beginning. Some traditions said that captured elves had been tormented and corrupted. Others sought a different origin. All agreed upon the hand behind them. They were the mockery and soldiery of Morgoth, bred for obedience, but filled with private malice, capable of craft, speech, discipline, and treachery. Many were short and crooked, bow-legged or long-armed, broad-faced, swart, sallow, or black-skinned, with slanting eyes and mouths made harsher by hunger and hatred. They endured pain and marched far, but most hated the light of the sun, which weakened or distressed them. Their tribes spoke debased forms of other tongues among themselves, for their own speech fractured with every generation, and later Sauron gave them the black speech for command. Goblin was no separate race from Orc. It was another name, used more often in the northern lands and in the speech of hobbits. Among them were many peoples and ranks, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, including those of Moria and Goblin Town, the Orcs of Mordor, tribes from the east that had long lived beyond any Dark Lord's immediate rule, the forces of Isengard, trackers and hunters trained to follow spoor, and the larger Uruks, called Uruk-hai when they spoke of themselves as the Orc folk. Lesser Orcs were contemptuously called Snaga, slave or servant. The old word hobgoblin was sometimes applied to larger Orcs, but no distinct nation stood behind it. Even before the first sunrise, there were trolls as well, huge and immensely strong, their origins no clearer than the Orcs. Treebeard believed they had been made in mockery of Ents, as Orcs were a mockery of the children. The earliest trolls were dull, brutal, and clumsy in speech. Stone trolls could not endure daylight at all. When the sun touched them, they hardened into lifeless rock. Other breeds would later be armed and taught by Sauron, until some could obey orders, use language, and endure conditions that would have destroyed their forebears. Morgoth did not trust only to armies shaped like men. In the deep vaults of Angband, he bred dragons. The first to come forth was Glaurung, afterwards called the father of dragons. He had 4 powerful legs and no wings. His scales shone like beaten gold. Fire came from his mouth, and behind the malice of his speech lay a will able to dominate those who met his gaze. He emerged while still young, before his armor had hardened, and Fingon drove him back with mounted archers. For 2 centuries he remained hidden. When he came again, he was full grown, and the fire that rolled before him broke the siege of Angband. He fought in the Dagor Bragaloch and the Nir Neth Arnoediad, crawled across fields where elves and men had already spent their strength, and finally descended upon Nargothrond. The bridge the elves had built for their own passage gave the dragon entry. Glaurung scattered their warriors, burned their halls,
piled their treasure beneath him, and caught Turin Turambar with his eyes. His power did not rest in flame alone. He spoke truth twisted toward ruin, falsehood wrapped around truth, and commands that continued to work after he had passed from sight. He sent Turin away while Morwen and Nienor remained in peril, then later stripped Nienor of memory, until she stood before him unable even to name herself.
At Cabed en Aris, Turin waited beneath the ravine, while Glaurung crossed overhead. The dragon's belly was softer than his armoured back. Turin drove Gurthong upward into it. Glaurung thrashed across the gorge, black blood steaming around the blade, and with his final words restored Nienor's memory, only so that she would understand the horror into which his lies had led her. She cast herself into the river. Turin fell upon his sword. The dragon died, but nothing his voice had broken was made whole. Wolves also multiplied beneath Morgoth's shadow, and Sauron, his greatest servant, made them into vessels for darker things. The werewolves of the First Age were not merely large wolves. Evil spirits were imprisoned in their bodies, giving them intelligence and cruelty beyond natural beasts. Draugluin was the first, and the sire of the breed. His descendants guarded Tol in Gauroth, the Isle of Werewolves, where Sauron held his prisoners.
There were vampires, too, creatures able to take great bat-like form. Only one is named, Cirith, Sauron's messenger, who flew with iron claws and carried messages between the dark powers. Against them came Huan, the Hound of Valinor. He was a great wolfhound, as large as a small horse, tireless and sleepless, granted the power to speak on only 3 occasions, and fated to die only when he met the greatest wolf that would ever walk the world.
Huan chose loyalty beyond the command of his first master. He aided Luthien, slew Draugluin, and defeated Sauron when Sauron took the form of a monstrous wolf. Beorn and Luthien then used the hides of Draugluin and Thuringwethil to approach Angband, where the greatest of all werewolves waited. Carcharoth had been bred from Draugluin's line and fed by Morgoth upon the flesh of elves and men. He guarded the gates of Angband, vast, sleepless, and filled with a devouring spirit.
When Beorn fled, carrying a Silmaril, Carcharoth bit off the hand that held it. The jewel burned within his belly. Maddened by its holy fire, he ran across Beleriand, poisoning streams and killing every living thing in his path. Huan met him in the final hunt. Carcharoth mortally wounded both Beorn and Huan, but the hound closed his jaws upon the wolf and killed him. Huan spoke for the 3rd and last time, then died beside Beorn. The Silmaril was cut from the wolf's burned entrails, still held in Beorn's severed hand.
Through those same wars, the Balrogs moved, wherever the defense of the Noldor was strongest. Gothlog struck down Feanor after the first great victory of the returned elves had carried him too far from his army. He slew Fingon in the Nirnath Arnodiad, captured Hurin, and led the assault on Gondolin. At the city's fall, he fought Ecthelion of the Fountain. They killed one another, and both went down into the waters of the King's Fountain.
Thorondor and the eagles had watched over the hidden city from the encircling mountains, as they had watched the house of Fingolfin. Thorondor carried Fingolfin's body away, after the High King wounded Morgoth 7 times and died beneath his foot. The eagle tore Morgoth's face with his talons and left scars that the Dark Lord bore thereafter. Yet even the eagles could not prevent the ruin of Beleriand.
At the end of the First Age, the host of the West entered Middle-earth, and Morgoth released the last strength of Angband, winged dragons, creatures not seen before in battle. Their assault drove back even the armies of the Valar. Above them flew Ancalagon the Black, greatest of Morgoth's winged fire drakes. Eärendil came through the sky in Vingalot with the Silmaril upon his brow, and Thorondor led the eagles beside him. The battle in the air endured through the night.
At last, Eärendil slew Ancalagon. The dragon fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim and broke them beneath his body. Morgoth was defeated and cast out, but the victory drowned most of Beleriand, and many of the creatures he had made or corrupted escaped the ruin. Orcs fled east, dragons survived in the northern wastes, trolls remained in mountains and caves. At least one Balrog went down into darkness so profound that no eye followed it. The world passed into another age without being cleansed. Shelob also survived. She was the last known child of Ungoliant, and before Sauron took possession of Mordor, she came to the cleft above Cirith Ungol. There she lived in Toric Ungol, serving no lord, acknowledging no alliance, feeding upon elves, men, and whatever else entered her tunnels. Sauron tolerated her because she guarded a passage into his land, and because prisoners sent into her darkness rarely returned. He called her his cat, but she remained concerned only with her own hunger. Far to the west, the Ents and Entwives drifted apart. The Ents loved the great forests. The Entwives crossed the Anduin and made gardens in the lands that would later become the Brown Lands. Men learned agriculture from them. Then war passed over those gardens. Sauron's devastation left the country blasted and empty, and when the Ents came searching, the Entwives were gone. No certain word of them ever returned.
The Ents remembered their names, their voices, and the ordered fields they had loved, but memory was all that remained. Meanwhile, Sauron distributed 9 rings to powerful men. Their lives stretched, yet life itself became unbearable. Their bodies faded until they were invisible to mortal sight, and at last they existed as wraiths, bound to the One Ring and to its maker. They became the Nazgûl, the ring wraiths, 9 figures whose black robes, gloves, and armor gave shape to bodies that could no longer be seen. Their presence brought dread, their cries broke courage, their breath carried sickness and despair. 2 alone were named in surviving histories, Khamûl the Easterling, and the greatest of them, the Witch King. Before the age ended, another company of dead men was bound to the world.
The men of the White Mountains swore allegiance to Isildur, then refused his summons when the last alliance marched against Sauron. Isildur cursed them to find no rest until their oath was fulfilled. Their bodies died, but their shadows remained beneath Dwimorberg, awaiting an heir of Isildur who might call them to judgment.
The Third Age, the world under watch.
The Third Age began beneath the appearance of victory. Sauron had fallen, but the ring was lost rather than destroyed, and his servants did not all perish with him. Even in Gondor's early strength, there were creatures whose memory survived as a warning. Queen Beruthiel kept 10 cats, 9 black and 1 white, and used them as spies. They went where she could not, watched those whom she mistrusted, and returned with knowledge of what they had seen.
They were feared in Osgiliath, and when the queen was expelled, she was set adrift with them upon a ship. In the east lived the Kine of Araw, immense wild cattle said to descend from beasts once hunted by Orome. Vorindil hunted one of them near the Sea of Rune and fashioned its horn into the great heirloom later borne by the stewards of Gondor. Farther north, the Witch King established Angmar and gathered orcs, wolves, and evil men against Arnor. After the kingdoms of the north were shattered, he sent malignant spirits into the barrow mounds of the Barrow Downs. These became the Barrow Wights. They inhabited bones and grave goods, appearing as shadowy figures with pale eyes, cold voices, and colder hands. They could trap the living in dreams, clothe them like the dead, and prepare them for sacrifice upon the stone. The Witch King himself eventually fled before the combined forces of Gondor and the elves. Glorfindel foretold that he would not fall by the hand of man, and the words followed him like a shadow through the centuries. Beneath the misty mountains, another shadow awoke. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm mined ever deeper for mithril, until, in the year 1980 of the Third Age, they disturbed the Balrog that had escaped the destruction of Beleriand. It killed Durin the Sixth, and then Nine the First. The dwarves fled, and Khazad-dûm became Moria, the Black Pit. Orcs entered its halls. A dark pool spread before its western gate, dammed by waters that had crept down from the mountains, and in that pool dwelt the Watcher in the water. No history names its species or origin. Its body was never clearly seen. What emerged were long, pale green, luminous tentacles, sinuous and strong, their ends divided into probing fingers. Deeper still were the Nameless Things. They gnawed the earth far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, older than Sauron and unknown even to him. They were more loathsome than fish, but Gandalf refused to describe them after he had passed through their tunnels. The Balrog knew those passages. Nothing else recorded in the histories did. The Watcher may have belonged to that older darkness, but no witness proved it, and the uncertainty remained more disturbing than a name would have been. Dragons continued to breed in the wastes beyond the Grey Mountains. Not all were winged, and not all breathed fire. The cold drakes of the north attacked the dwarves and drove them from their halls. One killed Dane Ai and his son Fror.
Scatha the Worm, a great, long-bodied dragon of the Grey Mountains, amassed treasure stolen from dwarves and men until Fram of the Aotheod killed him. The dwarves demanded the return of the hoard. Fram sent them Scatha's teeth, declaring that jewels of such quality would not easily be matched. Violence followed the insult, though the full end of the quarrel was not preserved. The dragon's treasure entered the inheritance of the Northmen, and part of it later came to Rohan. Among those Northmen also arose the line of the Mearas, horses stronger, swifter, and more intelligent than ordinary steeds, long-lived and capable of understanding human speech. Their lineage was said to descend from horses brought out of the west, perhaps even from the race of Nahar. Felaroth, first of their royal line, killed Leod when the young lord tried to master him. Leod's son Eol confronted the stallion and demanded lifelong service as the price of his father's death. Felaroth submitted, carried Eol south to the aid of Gondor, and became the ancestor of the greatest horses of Rohan. Only kings and princes ordinarily rode the Mearas. One day, an exception would be made for a wandering wizard. Near the middle of the age, beside the Gladden fields, a Stour hobbit named Smeagol went fishing with his kinsman Deagol. Deagol found a golden ring in the river. Smeagol desired it at once. When Deagol refused to surrender it, Smeagol strangled him and hid the body. The ring gave him invisibility and lengthened his life, but it also sharpened suspicion, secrecy, and malice already present within him. His family cast him out. Driven from sunlight and company, he crawled into the roots of the misty mountains and remained there for centuries. The ring altered him. He became small, nearly hairless, pale and emaciated, with a scrawny neck, long arms, flat feet, and thin, clammy fingers, quick enough to seize fish in black water. His eyes grew large and luminous in darkness. Only 6 teeth remained in his mouth. He moved close to the ground with the speed and silence of a spider, ate fish raw, and strangled lone goblins when he could catch them. A swallowing sound in his throat gave him his new name, Gollum. He spoke to himself because no one else remained. Smeagol and Gollum became 2 voices within the same ruined creature, one still remembering kindness, and the other serving hunger, fear, and the ring. Yet even after almost 500 years, he did not understand what the ring truly was. He called it his precious, and believed possession to be the same as love. Rohan was founded after Eol rode south on Felaroth, and the land remembered not only its horses, but the creatures that killed its kings. Folka hunted the Great Boar of Everholt and slew it, but the boar wounded him with its tusks, and the king died before he could be carried from the forest. In the north, a greater disaster came on wings. Smaug, a fire drake from the wastes, descended upon Erebor in the year 2070. He was vast, winged and red golden, with scales hard enough enough to turn ordinary weapons. Fire poured from his jaws and nostrils. He destroyed Dale, drove the dwarves from the lonely mountain, and lay upon their treasure for more than a century and a half. Gold and jewels embedded themselves in the softer scales of his underside, until they formed an accidental coat of armor. But a small bare place remained beneath his left breast. Smaug knew the size and placement of every object in his hoard.
He could detect the absence of a single cup, and his voice was as dangerous as his flame, courteous when cruelty amused him, and venomous when suspicion stirred. South of Erebor, Thror returned in secret to Moria and was captured by Azog, the orc chieftain who ruled there. Azog was a great orc, tall and powerful, and he branded his name upon Thror's severed head before casting it out to the dwarf's companion. The insult began the war of the dwarfs and orcs.
At Azanulbazar, before Moria's eastern gate, Azog killed Nine, but was overtaken by Nine's young son Dane Ironfoot, who cut off his head. Azog's son Bolg survived and inherited the hatred. Then came the journey of Thorin Oakenshield, and many creatures that had remained separated by distance and darkness were drawn into one road. In the Troll Shores, Thorin's company was captured by 3 stone trolls named Bert, Tom, and William. They were enormous, coarse, and strong enough to carry dwarves in sacks, but slow of thought and easily divided by argument. Gandalf imitated their voices from the darkness until dawn came. Sunlight struck them, and they became stone where they stood. Their petrified bodies remained beside the road. Higher in the misty mountains, a thunderstorm broke over the company, while stone giants hurled rocks across the peaks, as though the mountains were playthings. Nothing certain was recorded of those giants beyond their immense size and their presence in the storm. Seeking shelter, the travellers entered a cave that opened into Goblin Town. The great goblin ruled there over orcs of the Misty Mountains. He was killed when Gandalf rescued the prisoners, but during the escape, Bilbo Baggins was separated from the others and fell into the tunnels beneath the mountains. There he found Gollum's ring before he found Gollum. Their contest of riddles ended when Bilbo discovered that the ring made him invisible. Gollum guessed what had been lost and blocked the exit, but Bilbo leapt over him rather than kill him. That act of pity left Gollum alive and the ring in the world beyond its cave. No one yet understood the weight of either consequence. Outside the mountains, the orcs hunted the company with wargs, great evil wolves that possessed speech and intelligence, and often served as the mounts and allies of orc kind. Their chief was a huge grey warg. The pack trapped the travellers in trees, while goblins set fire beneath them, but the great eagles descended from the mountains and carried them away. The Lord of the Eagles who commanded that rescue was never certainly identified with Gwaihir, though later tellings sometimes confused them. Beyond the Carcharoth lived Beorn. He was not a bear that could become a man, but a man and skin changer who could take the shape of an immense black bear. In human form, he was extraordinarily tall, broad-shouldered and strong, with black hair and beard, dressed in a woolen tunic.
He lived among intelligent animals that he did not eat or exploit, and he mistrusted strangers, dwarves and orcs, for reasons rooted in old violence. Once convinced of the company's purpose, he sheltered them and gave them ponies, food and counsel. His descendants, the Beornings, retained the power of skin changing for generations, though not all equaled him in size or strength. In Mirkwood, the descendants of Ungoliant had spread among the trees.
The great spiders were black or grey, large enough to bind dwarves in webbing, and able to speak in thin, hateful voices. They feared light, blades, and fire, but they ruled much of the darkened forest by numbers and ambush. Bilbo, made invisible by the ring, killed several and freed his companions. He named his sword Sting after the first creature it wounded in his defense. During the same passage, the company encountered a white hind and her fawns, pale shapes crossing the dark river.
No supernatural nature was confirmed for them, but their appearance in that corrupted forest was unlike the common beasts of the road, an image of unspoiled life glimpsed and immediately lost among the trunks. Farther east lived the ravens of Erebor, long-lived birds able to speak with the dwarves. Kark had been friend to Thror. His son Roak, old and nearly blind, carried news and counsel during Thorin's return. An unnamed thrush played a still greater part. It overheard Bilbo's account of the bear patch in Smaug's armour and carried the knowledge to Bard of Dale. When Smaug attacked Lake Town, Bard used his last arrow against that place. The shaft entered the dragon's breast. Smaug fell burning upon the town he had intended to destroy. His horde remained beneath the mountain, and armies came for it. Bolg led the orcs and wargs to Erebor, while great bats flew above them in such numbers that the light dimmed beneath their wings.
The battle of 5 armies had nearly been lost when the eagles appeared. Then Beorn came in bear shape, larger and more terrible than any beast upon the field. He carried the wounded Thorin out of the fighting, broke through Bolg's guard, and crushed Bolg himself. The northern orcs were shattered. The death of Smaug did not prove that all dragons were dead. Others may have remained in the cold wastes, beyond the limits of recorded journeys.
Nor did the strange name of the Whirlworms establish another known race of monsters. Bilbo had once spoken of them as dwelling in the last desert, east of the east, but no witness described their form, no history recorded a battle with them, and no traveller brought back proof. They remained at the edge of Hobbit imagination, where distant lands became large enough to contain anything feared.
Gollum, however, was no rumour. After losing the ring, he left his cave and followed its trail. His search carried him toward Mordor, where Sauron had risen again. He was captured and tormented until 2 names were forced from him: Shire and Baggins. Sauron released him, expecting his movements to serve the hunt. Aragorn later captured him and delivered him to the elves of Mirkwood, but orcs attacked, and Gollum escaped.
By then, the Nazgûl had crossed the river in black robes, riding great black horses trained to endure their presence. The Witch King led them. Though invisible beneath his garments, he was man-high and crowned, and at times
A red light could be seen where his eyes should have been. At Weathertop, he stabbed Frodo with a Morgul knife, leaving a splinter that worked toward the heart and threatened to turn the bearer into a wraith.
The 9 were swept away at the ford of Bruinen, but their horses were destroyed, not the riders themselves. They returned to Mordor and mounted creatures more ancient and dreadful.
Before Frodo reached the Nazgûl, the borders of the Shire had already opened onto older perils. In the Old Forest stood Old Man Willow, an immense and malicious tree beside the Withywindle. His exact nature was never named. He was not called an Ent, yet he possessed will, memory, and power. His influence spread to root and branch, turning paths, bending the forest's hostility, and sending sleep into those who rested nearby.
He trapped Merry and Pippin within his trunk and sought to drown Frodo in the river until Tom Bombadil compelled him to release them. On the Barrow Downs, a wight captured the hobbits and laid them beneath the mound in pale garments, adorned them with gold, and placed a sword across their throats. Its arm moved through the darkness, while a cold chant filled the chamber. Bombadil broke the spell and scattered the treasure into sunlight. From that hoard, Merry received a blade forged in the wars against Angmar. The weapon would travel farther than its makers had foreseen.
Saruman had meanwhile filled Isengard with his own armies. Crabane, large black crows from Dunland and Fangorn, ranged across the country as spies. Orcs laboured beneath Orthanc, and among them were Uruk-hai, able to march and fight beneath the sun. They were broader, taller, and stronger than many northern goblins, equipped with short, broad-bladed swords, bows and shields marked with the white hand. Ugluk commanded the company that killed Boromir and carried away Merry and Pippin.
Mordor orcs under Grishnark joined them. Grishnark was short, broad, crook-legged, and so long-armed that his hands nearly touched the ground. He understood enough of the ring's importance to search the captives for it, and that private greed helped destroy him. Saruman also employed wolf riders and men in whom orcish traits were visible, sallow, squint-eyed goblin men, and half-orcs able to pass among ordinary men more easily than full orcs could. Nothing in the histories supports a separate order of explosive armoured Uruk berserkers. The true horror of Isengard required no such invention. Its strength lay in disciplined orcs, corrupted men, machinery, fire, and the knowledge of a wizard who had chosen domination.
Before Isengard's army marched, the Fellowship entered Moria. At the western gate, the Watcher stirred beneath the dark water. One tentacle closed around Frodo's ankle. When it was cut, many more emerged, writhing across the shore. The creature seized the stone doors after the Fellowship escaped, and brought rock and tree down across them. Within the mine, orcs gathered to attack. A cave troll thrust its arm through the doorway of the chamber of Mazabul. Its skin was dark greenish and covered in scales, its foot broad and flat without toes. Boromir's sword glanced from its arm, but sting pierced the foot, and black blood smoked upon the blade. The company fled through halls where drums answered one another in the deep. Then Durin's Bane came. It appeared as a great shadow in the shape of a man, but larger, surrounded by darkness in which fire kindled. A blade of flame was in one hand, and a whip in the other.
Its arrival silenced the orcs and filled the chamber with a fear older than their race. On the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf broke the stone beneath it, but the falling Balrog's whip caught his legs and dragged him into the abyss. They plunged beyond the knowledge of the dwarves, fought in the depths beside the Nameless Things, climbed through forgotten tunnels, and ascended the endless stair to the peak of Cirith Ungol. There the Balrog's fire was extinguished, leaving it a thing of slime and shadow, until flame returned upon the mountain. Gandalf cast it down. Durin's Bane broke the mountainside in its fall, and the last known Balrog of Middle-earth passed out of the histories. The orcs who captured Merry and Pippin never reached Isengard. Riders of Rohan surrounded them, and the quarrels among Ugluk, Grishnach, and the lesser orcs split the company before the attack began. The hobbits escaped into Fangorn, where they met Treebeard. He stood about 14 feet high, stiff-limbed and immensely strong, with bark-like skin, a sweeping grey beard, and deep eyes that seemed filled with a green light, and with memories older than kingdoms.
His voice could be low and murmuring, or rise like wind through timber. He was the oldest of the Ents still walking in Middle-earth. His name in the language of the elves was Fangorn, as was the forest itself. He carried the hobbits through the trees and called in Entmoot. Ents did not decide quickly. Their language required time, because the things worth saying had long lives. Yet when they understood the extent of Saruman's destruction, their patience ended.
Quickbeam, Bregalad, was already resolved. He was younger and more hasty than most Ents, with a body and character resembling the rowan trees he loved, and Saruman's orcs had cut those trees down. The Ents marched upon Isengard. Their hands tore stone as roots split earth. They broke the gates, flooded the furnaces, and trapped Saruman in Orthanc. Huans came with them, trees that had become wakeful, or Ents that had grown tree-like, moving swiftly beneath darkness, despite their stillness by day. They entered the valley of Helm's Deep and waited beyond the battlefield. The fleeing orcs ran beneath their branches. By morning, none emerged, and a mound covered what remained. Yet after victory, Treebeard's deepest loss remained untouched. He could break Saruman's walls, but he could not find the Entwives. As the war widened, the Nine took to the air. Their mounts were the creatures called fell beasts, or black wings, huge, naked things, without feathers, with long necks, vast webbed pinions stretched between horned fingers, beaks, claws, and a carrion stench. Their origin was not known. They appeared to belong to an older world, preserved and bred by Sauron for the Nazgûl. Horses panicked beneath them. Men threw themselves down when their shadows passed. The riders' cries carried the black breath, a sickness of cold despair that could leave the living unconscious or dying without a wound.
The Witch King rode the greatest of those beasts and led the armies that issued from Minas Morgul. Below him moved the hosts of Mordor, orcs of many tribes, great black uruks, lesser snagger driven by whips, tracker orcs trained to follow scent across stone, and trolls strengthened for war. They spoke little beyond the black speech and possessed a brutal cunning absent from older troll kind. Mountain trolls hauled the enormous ram Grond toward the gate of Minas Tirith. Hill trolls, a distinct though little described kind, had long haunted the wild. One had killed Aragorn's grandfather, Arador. Stronger still were the Olog High, bred by Sauron late in the age. They were taller than men, covered in horny scales, and armed with hammers and round shields. Unlike stone trolls, they could endure the sun so long as Sauron's will held them.
Gollum followed Frodo and Sam into the Emyn Moil, and was caught. Frodo mastered him through the ring, and made him swear upon the precious to guide them into Mordor. For a time, the remnant called Smeagol appeared to gain ground over Gollum. He led them through the dead marshes, and warned them of the pale faces beneath the water, the remnants of men, elves, and orcs who had fallen in the ancient war.
Yet the ring remained between them, and Sam's distrust struck whenever Smeagol approached anything like loyalty. At the Forbidden Pool, Frodo saved Gollum from the archers of Faramir, but did so by luring him into capture. Gollum understood only the betrayal. He led them towards Cirith Ungol and the mother he knew there. Shelob came through the tunnels behind them, her head thrust forward upon a short, stalk-like neck. Many clustered eyes shone above her beak, and venom dripped from her mouth. Her body was black, bloated, and marked beneath with a pale, luminous belly. Her legs bent high around her, covered in hard, steel-like hairs and ending in claws. At the end of her body was a sting. The Phial of Galadriel forced her back, but Gollum attacked Sam, and when the light was lowered, Shelob struck Frodo and wrapped him. Sam took Sting and the phial. He wounded one of Shelob's eyes, then stood beneath her as she attempted to crush him. Her own weight drove the elven blade deep into her belly. She retreated into darkness, grievously wounded. Whether she died there was never known. Orcs from the tower of Cirith Ungol found Frodo. Shagrat, a great Uruk commanding the tower, and Gorbag, captain of a company from Minas Morgul, understood that Shelob kept her victims alive for later feeding. Their troops carried Frodo inside, then quarrelled over his mithril coat and possessions. Suspicion became violence. The orcs slaughtered one another through the tower until Shagrat escaped with Frodo's cloak, mail, and sword. Sam entered after him and confronted the two watchers at the gate. These were not living beasts, but carved guardians inhabited by a malignant vigilance. Each appeared as three joined bodies seated upon the stone, with vulture-like faces and black eyes turned outward, inward, and across the entrance. Their will formed a barrier that resisted passage. The phial broke their concentration, and they answered with a shrill alarm. Beyond the tower, Mordor's orcs hunted the fugitives. Their trackers quarrelled like all orcs when no greater fear controlled them. They could follow spoor and scent, but they could not imagine endurance guided by mercy, and Frodo and Sam passed toward Mount Doom.
Elsewhere, Aragorn entered the paths of the dead. The Oathbreakers gathered behind him as a grey, silent host. Their king bore no living flesh, yet the shadow of a crown remained upon him. They followed Aragorn through the mountains and south to Peligir, where Terror of the Dead drove the Corsairs from their ships. When the enemy was defeated, Aragorn declared the ancient oath fulfilled. The King of the Dead broke his spear, bowed and vanished. The host dissolved with him, freed after more than 3,000 years. Aragorn sailed for Minas Tirith, while the battle had already begun. On the Pelennor fields, the Haradrim brought Mumakil, the creatures called Oliphants in the Shire.
They were elephant-like, but immense beyond the animals known in northern lands. Legs like trees, bodies that towered above houses, great ears, long trunks, tusks and hides so thick that ordinary arrows rarely pierced them. The Haradrim placed war towers upon their backs. Horses feared their scent and would not willingly approach. Amid them rode the Witch King upon his winged beast. Theoden charged on Snowmane, his white horse, who may have belonged to the race of the Mearas.
A dart struck Snowmane. He fell, crushing the king beneath him. The Witch King descended. Éowyn of Rohan stood between him and Theoden. She cut the head from the fell beast, and its vast pinions collapsed upon the field. The Witch King shattered her shield and raised his mace, but Merry struck him behind the knee with the blade taken from the Barrow Downs. The weapon had been forged against Angmar, and its stroke broke the spell that bound the wraith's unseen sinews.
Éowyn drove her sword into the emptiness between crown and mantle. The Witch King passed away with a cry. No living man had killed him. A hobbit and a woman had fulfilled the words spoken centuries before. One of the last Mearas carried Gandalf through the same war. Shadowfax was silver-grey by day and seemed white in darkness, the chief of his race, capable of running with a speed no ordinary horse could sustain. He tolerated no saddle or bridle and bore Gandalf by choice.
He carried him from Rohan, through siege and battle, and into the final days before the Black Gate. There, the remaining forces of the West stood before Mordor. The mouth of Sauron rode out to meet them. He was no wraith and no unknown species, but a living man of black Númenórean descent who had entered Sauron's service and learned sorcery. He had served so long that he had forgotten his own name.
Tall and dressed in black, with a high black helm, he rode an enormous, hideous black horse, or horse-like creature, whose face resembled a skull and whose nostrils burned red. He displayed Frodo's mithril coat, cloak, and sword, and claimed that their owner had been captured. His terms demanded the surrender of the West. Gandalf rejected them. The mouth returned behind the gate, and his fate after Sauron's fall was not recorded. Then the gate opened, and the last armies came forth. Orcs of Mordor and the East, hill trolls and Olog-hai, men from the south and east, and every remnant Sauron could command. Frodo and Sam had meanwhile reached the Sammath Naur. At the edge of the fire, Frodo could no longer surrender the ring. He claimed it and placed it upon his finger.
Far away, Sauron perceived him, and the Nazgûl turned toward Mount Doom. Gollum attacked. He bit through Frodo's finger and took the ring into his mouth.
For one instant, he stood triumphant, thin body dancing above the abyss. The precious returned after all the years beneath the mountain. Then he lost his footing. Gollum and the ring fell together into the fire. The thing for which he had murdered, hidden, hunted, lied, starved and endured beyond the natural life of his people, was destroyed with him. Barad-dûr collapsed. The Nazgûl were caught in the ruin of the mountain and vanished in flame. Sauron's will was withdrawn from his servants.
The Ologhai that depended upon it faltered. Orcs fled, killed one another, or were destroyed. The creatures of the Black Land lost the power that had held their armies together. Gwaihir the Wind Lord came with his brother Landravol and the eagle Meneldur. Gwaihir, greatest of the eagles of the north in that age, and a descendant of Thorondor, had already rescued Gandalf from Orthanc and borne him from Zirax's eagle after the battle with the Balrog.
Now the 3 eagles flew into the ash above Mordor and carried Frodo and Sam from the ruin. The fall of Sauron ended the dominion that had gathered these creatures into one war, but it did not answer every question or kill every ancient thing. Shadowfax bore Gandalf to the Grey Havens and passed over the sea with him, the last recorded Meara to leave Middle-earth. The Beornings guarded the crossings of the Anduin, and the line of Beorn continued for a time. The eagles withdrew from the wars of men.
Treebeard remained in Fangorn, older and lonelier, still unable to learn the fate of the Entwives. The Huorns stood silent beneath their leaves. Old Man Willow remained beside the Withywindle. No one returned to the deepest tunnels beneath Moria to name the Nameless Things. The Watcher in the water was not seen again, but neither was its death recorded. Shelob's wounded body vanished into the blackness of Cirith Ungol, and no witness discovered whether she healed, starved, or died.
Dragons may still have lingered beyond the northern wastes, diminished but not certainly extinct. Orcs and trolls survived in scattered places after their master's fall, though without Sauron's will, their kingdoms broke into frightened tribes. The great Mumakil remained in the south. Wargs still hunted where the wild grew cruel. The white deer of Mirkwood left no lineage in song, and the Werworms remained only a name beyond the furthest map.
Middle-earth entered the dominion of men not as a world emptied of wonders and terrors, but as one in which the oldest creatures withdrew from sight. Their tracks faded, their halls collapsed, their names became stories told beside fires by people who no longer understood how close the darkness had once stood, listening beyond the light.